Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Susan Blackmore. She is a psychologist, lecturer, and writer researching consciousness, memes, and anomalous experiences, and a visiting professor at the University of Plymouth. She is best known for her book, The Meme Machine, and has also written or contributed to over 40 books, mostly on consciousness, but also on other topics that we'll probably cover today. So, Dr. Blackmore, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
You're very welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, great. So the topic that we're going to explore today the most is memetics, of course. And I guess that this is somewhat of a controversial topic because particularly academics, when they think about memetics, they usually associate it with an approach to human culture, right? And I guess that there are a lot of academics, and I've had a couple of them on the show, like Dr. Peter Richerson and Robert Boyd, who are not really fans, let's say, of memetics. They have some criticisms of it. But just to be fair, could you please tell us first what you would say memetics is really about?
Yes, I would say it's really about universal Darwinism. It's taking the selfish gene view or approach to Darwinism and applying that way beyond biology. This was where Richard Dawkins started. I mean, he invented the term meme in his famous 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. And his whole argument there was he'd done this brilliant book for the time. I mean, still a great book, but obviously it's a long time ago. But he explained the selfish gene theory applied to biology. But he wanted to make this very important point. What Darwin saw can be put in modern algorithmic informational terms. What Darwin saw was if you take any information or any object or anything and copy it lots of times, but with slight variations, and then throw away the vast majority of those copies and take just a few and copy those, repeat, design appears out of nowhere. Not out of nowhere, but it appears to be out of nowhere. You don't need a designer to produce design. The evolutionary algorithm, copy, vary, select, repeat, will produce design, will produce adaptation to a particular environment. So Richard Dawkins' point there was that doesn't just apply to genes, it applies to all this stuff in culture. It applies to the words I'm speaking to you, it applies to my keyboard here, it applies to my glasses, my clothes, and these pictures and books. Oh, the books, they're all stuffed with memes. So that's the essence of memetics, is to treat cultural objects or whatever you like, to call them memes, implying that they, like genes, are a replicator. They're the information that's copied with variation selection. Now, Richerson and Boyd have some really useful criticisms of memetics, which are important to take on board, and some things we disagree with, but fundamentally, they will not say that cultural items are a replicator. That's the big difference. Richard and I and the few memeticists in the world will say, yeah, apply Darwinian thinking to all of this. It's all replicators. And then I get to the idea of there could be more replicators. Boyd and Richerson and many others will say, yes, culture evolves, but not by having another replicator.
Mm-hmm. So that's the issue here, right? The fact that perhaps some people don't agree with us calling a unit of culture, let's say. I don't know if even talking about a unit of culture is the most correct thing to do here, because I mean, what are we really talking about here when we talk about a unit of culture? Because that's really hard to define, and I guess that even when I talked with doctors Boyd and Richerson, I mean, at a certain point I asked them what would be the unit of culture that they would consider, and it's really hard to define, right?
Yes, and I think this is a red herring. I think this whole argument about units comes about because in language, it's much easier to talk about a meme as a unit, but they don't naturally fall into units. But they're not a genes. I mean, you can snip out a gene and say this is responsible for this protein, but, you know, genes can be looked at in lots of different ways, as can memes. So if you think of a unit, I mean, to take the most famous example, people talk about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You know, what's the unit? Well, I would say, and Dan Dennett, the philosopher, would say also, well, it depends what's passed on. Where the na 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 becomes part of an advert, you know, that's the unit. But where you give somebody a CD with the thing on, or you download it from somewhere, you'll download the entire symphony, that's the unit. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Is my answer. But in a way, I had another thought about your first question, which applies here. If you take the view that memes are replicators, which Boyd and Richerson don't, then you see that the power rests with replicator power, rests with the memes. They're evolving. They're using our brains to evolve themselves. That's where the power comes from. It's not for us, it's for them. Whereas for Boyd and Richerson and for almost all the other people doing research on cultural evolution, it is part of our phenotype. It's for us. It's for our genes. It's benefiting the first replicator, the genes, the biology, the actual human being. Memetics denies that. And this is where the real difference lies. Because Memetics would say, hey, you know what? We're the meme machines, hence the title of my book, The Meme Machine. We're the meme machines that are kind of inadvertently doing the work for the memes. We sit here all day long, you know, sending stuff out, talking, typing, using our phones and, you know, all of this stuff for the sake of the memes. Mm-hmm. That's kind of an extreme way of putting it, but that makes clear the difference between the two approaches.
Mm-hmm. So one of the criticisms that Dr. Richerson made on the interview I had with him was basically that he thought that when you or Dr. Dawkins or whoever talks about memetics, people that he thinks that you tend to talk about memes as an analogy to virus or something like that, something that really infects our minds and that get expressed beyond our control, and sometimes that even enter in conflict with our genetics and with our evolutionary interests even. And he told me that he thinks that's not really a good enough approach, because he told me that he thinks that most of the time what we transmit to each other culturally are things that are really good for us, and perhaps he thought that you focus too much on the negative side of things. So is that a fair criticism or not?
Yes, I think that's a fair criticism. I think there are two things going on here. One is the use of the term virus, which I think I've been guilty of using in, well, there are so many ways to use the term virus, and I've been guilty of perhaps being rather lax about it. I would say it's, what you were saying there is quite right with respect to this idea that we are infected by memes. I mean, we don't choose which ones we bump into. If we walk, I live in the country, but if I go up to London and I walk down the street and there's stuff coming at me, you can't turn off your reading ability and not see the poster. And, you know, we're bombarded all the time with this stuff. But of course, our job, if you think of it from a memetic point of view, we are a creature of two replicators. Our bodies are striving to stay alive in the way that the genes we've inherited from our genes, and our minds are struggling to make sure that we take on the memes that are going to be good, true, useful, beautiful, in some way of value to us. But the memes don't care. They're selfish replicators. They're just information that is either copied or not. They don't care about us. So it's always a kind of a battle. I don't want to make it too violent, but it's a struggle between selfish memes that just want to get copied however they can, and we humans who try to only copy the ones that we want to copy. And I mean, Boyd and Richerson are being very positive there. By and large, we copy the ones we want. I hope that's true. But in the modern world of social media and so on, the memes are getting pretty powerful, and the balance, let's look at that. So that's one side of your very interesting question. The other side, going back to the viruses, is looked at the way I've just described. We have to ask whether something is a virus from the point of view of what or whom. So this is how I've got myself in a muddle, and people tell me things that I believe that I don't. If you look from the genes point of view, religions are great. I mean, if you're thinking about virus as being something bad that infects you and does harm, and not all viruses are, you see, a lot of viruses do you good. But if you think about them from the point of view of doing harm, then I would say that from the genes point of view, most religions go forth and multiply. The very strict Jews having the greatest number of children per woman on the planet. So from that point of view, religions are good from the genes point of view. From us humans' point of view, are they good? Well, they encourage social interactions, which seems to produce a little bit of increased happiness amongst people, but they cause enormous harm to people's understanding of the world, to their fairness, to their morality. They claim what I call the altruism trick. The religions claim, oh, we're good because we follow Jesus, or we're good because we follow Allah. And actually, they don't do any more good. And of course, well, let me not talk about wars. But that's some of the complications we have around the concept of a virus. And of course, from the memes point of view themselves, well, some are and some aren't. So you have to think, for whom are you asking, is it a virus, before you can start to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so two things there. The first one is about our ability to really control what happens in our minds, because I guess that people get very frustrated very quickly when they know about research that really points to our lack of free will, and also the fact that many things that happen in our minds and that motivate us to do this or that, they happen mostly at a subconscious level, and then perhaps we do something, and only after the fact do we come up with a post hoc rationalization to what we've done. So that's the first part of it, the fact that perhaps the infectious side of things, being it about memes or even other approaches to culture, perhaps that's just how things work, that we don't really have that much control over what happens in our minds and the ways by which things we are exposed to operate and influence us. So, but the other aspect of it
is complicated enough.
Oh, okay. So would you like perhaps to comment on that?
Yes, I would. It's really interesting, but I couldn't hold any more in my head. So these ideas you're expressing to do with free will, to do with do we have control over our own, what? Who is this me who might be controlling my thoughts? I would say I'm just one of those thoughts. So when I have something like, oh, a struggle in my mind, I don't want to think about that. That's horrid. I want to think about this. This is a battle going on here between a self system, which describes a self who lives inside there, that doesn't really exist in any other way. You know, we describe ourselves as a sort of powerful conscious entity that might survive death and so on, when actually it's just more processing, more thoughts going on in a brain, and they fight with each other, and some control others and some don't. And of course, what you're describing there is nothing specifically to do with memetics. It's to do with everything that's happening in neuroscience, is to see that all these things are going on in a brain that does not need a soul or a spirit or anything like that to do any controlling. So of course, this brings up the wonderful topic of free will. And again, people are afraid of memetics because it seems to undermine free will. But it's not just memetics. It's everything we're learning about the brain. I mean, you can now, with difficulty, with the latest technology, actually see what someone is thinking about. or if they're watching a video, what's happening in the video, and even what they're dreaming about. We know that a lot of the control of our behavior, inhibition and so on, is from the frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex controlling other parts of the brain. The more we learn about this, and what you mentioned about post hoc justification or rationalization, that is ubiquitous. Loads and loads of experiments show that. And because I'm a long-term meditator, I've been meditating every day for, I don't know, more than 30 years, I think. I watch these things. I watch myself, this body, I watch her do something. And then I watch the thought come up, oh, I decided to. And I can see that happening. The more you are able to observe, to keep the mind quiet and observe it, the more these things come up. So it seems to me very obvious that free will is an illusion. It's something we make up to kind of explain how we behave in the world. And, well, another step is to say, let's live without the illusion. But that's another whole question. But certainly I don't see any reason to believe that free will, as in my thoughts cause my actions, I am something in here in control of my body. It's not so. We have to get used to it. So memetics is not the enemy here. It's not the only enemy of free will. It is one of the many ways in which science undermines our very natural ideas, which are, of course, are promoted by religions, are essential to the major religions. Why those ideas are false.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, we have a lot of evidence against free will and even about that phenomenon of post hoc rationalization. For example, Michael Gazzaniga has done those experiments with the split brain patients, right? And how they come up with explanations after the fact for the decisions that they've made. And also even with normally functioning people in areas like social psychology. We really know that when we put people to experiment, then the justifications they come up with are not really the reasons behind their behavior. There are other underlying subconscious reasons that motivate them toward something, right? And so, I mean, it's pretty hard for people to really come up with a good scientific approach, let's say, to defend free will, at least in a solid way. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree, but I find it remarkable how difficult it is for people to throw over the idea. Some years ago, I did a book called Conversations on Consciousness, and I asked 20 odd of the top neuroscientists and philosophers. I asked about 20 of the top neuroscientists, philosophers, and so on who are interested in consciousness, similar questions, trying to understand their theories, being pretty damn, like you, asking difficult and interesting, I hope, questions. And one of the questions I asked all of them was, do you have free will? And I was shocked. There was only one, I think, Kevin O'Regan, who said, well, from the age of 4, I knew I was a machine and there's no place for free will. And, but he was the only really strong person saying there isn't. A couple of other people, Ramachandran, for example, and Dan Wegner, who's written a book called The Illusion of Conscious Will. Even he said, well, I feel I have to live as if there's free will. Otherwise, terrible things would happen. So there were a few like that who kind of admitted that they don't really believe in it, but they've got to kind of live as if they do. And the vast majority, of course I have free will. John Searle, absolutely, of course I have free will. Dan Dennett is probably my greatest hero in consciousness studies. I think his book, Consciousness Explained, is still brilliant, 30 years on. But he wrote a book called Freedom Evolves. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a kind of a con because he and I have had interesting discussions about that. We agree to disagree here. He is kind of trying to defend free will in a way that I think is illegitimate. He should have called that book Choice Evolves, because he talks about how pine trees only have a certain few choices where the roots to go and the leaf size and so on. Cats have far more, they run around and whatever, and humans have far more choices. Of course we do. I would say we are choice machines. we're choosing, not just choosing memes, but choosing all sorts of things. Of course, we've got lots of choices, but are they free? No. The concept of free will implies somehow that it's magical, that it's actually me, this conscious me, my conscious thoughts, the consciousness is doing the stuff, and that's why I'm free. I can do whatever I like regardless of what my brain is doing. That's what a lot of ordinary people will feel is happening, and that's what they believe in. So he kind of he mixes up the increased number of choices we have with the with whether they're free or not, and they're not free in my opinion. But as you have mentioned, this is one of the reasons people don't like memetics. Sadly, there are lots. And I think the main reason is the same as it was in Darwin's day. It's a simple idea that's so counterintuitive that it's hard to grasp. And the consequences are challenging to most people's beliefs about themselves. And so it's easier to go, no, that's rubbish. And that's what most people do.
Right. So let's go back to an earlier point where I referred to the fact that Dr. Richerson told me that perhaps you're too focused on the negative things that we are able to transmit to each other and perhaps that have negative consequences for us. But what do we really mean when we say that perhaps some ideas or some sort of information that we transmit to each other might not be good for us? I mean, what do you specifically mean by that? Is it the fact that perhaps from an evolutionary perspective they are not good for survival and reproduction, or perhaps that they lead us astray in terms of the moral environments where we live and that we created? What exactly?
All of those things. I would take happily Boyd and Richerson's criticism that maybe I concentrate too much on the negative things, but there's a very good reason for that, which I'm sure they understand and would agree, which is all the time I'm trying to think, is memetics worth it? Is it sufficiently different from these other theories of cultural evolution that it's worth going on doing research and talking in terms of memes? And one of the ways in which it is different is this. For Boyd and Richerson, as I said before, all of culture, and they do use the word memes sometimes, so allow me to keep using the word memes. All of the memes ultimately are part of our phenotype, a part of what's benefiting our genes and us as physical human beings. So when there are things that are bad for us, they are things that perhaps were not worth getting rid of because it's an effort to prevent things. And, you know, if they're not too bad, you don't do it. Or there could be other explanations, which they provide many of, as to why we still carry the burden of memes that are harmful to us. Whereas the memetic view is completely different. It is the memes, all of the stuff going around in culture, our language, ideas, behaviors, habits, skills, all of these memes, they're out for their own interests. And that's why there are so many that are bad for us. And we meme machines have to be the choosers to try to balance the memes that we take in, to keep out on the whole the ones that are bad for us and to keep the ones that are good for us, whatever that means to us. And what that means to us will depend on our genetics, our upbringing, the environment we're in, and so on. So it's a very different view. I have not yet come up with a brilliant experimental program that will test whether memetics or gene culture coevolution theory or all the other ones of that kind is better. If I could, and if I could carry it out, then we'd see which was better. I haven't, and no one else has done anything that's really clinches it in that way yet.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back now to the evolutionary history, let's say, of memetics, because in your book, it is 20 years old now, so perhaps you might have somewhat of a different approach to that side of things now, but you gave an account of how memes might have evolved, or the cognitive capacities that we had to acquire during our evolutionary history in order to be able to produce and transmit memes. Let's put it that way. So would you like to talk about that? Because you put a lot of emphasis on the fact that we ourselves as a human species really are able to over-imitate, and that's something that we can't find, for example, in other species, right?
Oh, let me describe that last bit first before I answer your question.
Okay.
Over imitation, what does this mean? The classic experiments, they were done some years ago with chimpanzees, I think, and have recently been repeated with other ape species. So I think it's a pretty robust finding. Give a task to another ape or a human child, which might be something like a very clever, complicated box, which has got some food inside or something that they want. And then you do something like you have a model, somebody who's going to demonstrate how to get the food out. And they might go press the button and the door opens and out, you get the food. Or they might go diddly-dom-dee, boo, boo, diddly-dee, boo, boo, yeah, right? Now, all of that is irrelevant, and both the other apes and the human children can probably see that it's irrelevant, because it's pretty obvious when you press the button that the door opens, whatever. I mean, I'm slightly making it up. They're not quite that, but this is the principle. Now, what happens is the kids will go, diddly boop, boop, whatever. I'm not copying myself perfectly. This is not a very well transmitted meme, but, whatever it is, they'll do something like that and press the button. Why? They might say for fun. I mean, whereas the other species will go for the food. They can tell all that, ignore all that. That's obviously the button, and they press it. Now, why? Why is that important? I think it's hugely important, because from the genes point of view, and from the human who might be hungry point of view, getting the food is what it's all about. From the meme's point of view, it's getting copied that it's all about. So the species that doesn't copy random, pointless, irrelevant things will get on better with the food and so on, probably. But the other one will allow the spread of these irrelevant behaviors. There will be processes weeding them out. Our human genes will be saying, hang on a minute, that's stupid to copy that. Nevertheless, there'll be times when it pays off. And I guess that this is part of the balancing act, the reason why we are the only species on this planet with more than teensy amount of culture, because we alone are so keen on imitation from very early on in our childhood. I've got two little granddaughters, aged 3 and 1. Oh, they copy, even the not quite 1-year-old, when I sent her a nice china mug thing, which the mother's was going to keep safe somewhere, she pulled it out the box and went like this, that just made me laugh. I thought, there you go, little imitator. So this is how memes got let loose. Over imitation is necessary. Imitating all kinds of things, whether they're useful or not, is necessary for this level of second replicator, meme replicator, to take off. And it's very dangerous for the biology, because if you copy too many dangerous things, you're dead and you don't pass on your ability to copy. So there must have been an environmental situation and where the lineage to current day humans was splitting off, where it was just right for over imitation to take off. And Boyd and Richerson themselves have contributed hugely to this, with studies a long time ago showing that with a certain level, not too much environmental change and not too little environmental change, imitation becomes useful. And this is one of my main arguments in the meme machine, is it was a kind of bottleneck. It was a very tricky moment that we might not have got through, because it's dangerous to imitate too many things, because you'll imitate dangerous things, harmful things. Nevertheless, we pulled through, and the consequence was the memes took off, using us meme machines and producing all this culture. Mm-hmm. I've long ago forgotten what your question was, but I hope that in some way it might have answered it. I'll have to ask again.
Right. Let me just ask you this first. So there aren't any other animals, at least that we know about, that really over-imitate. But on the other end, there are other animals that have at least some rudimentary forms of culture. Like, for example, some primates. There are some species of birds that have dialects, and also dolphins and whales. So, I mean, would that be enough, those sorts of very limited cultural behaviors that those species have, because they are also able to horizontally transmit them? Would they be enough to say that perhaps there are other species that also function as meme machines and that have memes?
Yes and no. I like to use the word culture to apply to all of those things you've described, because that's how it is in the literature, and that makes some kind of sense. But that doesn't make the distinction between the imitating species and the not imitating species. So if you take some famous examples of animal culture, for example, here in England, this morning for breakfast, I had my muesli and I had a bottle of milk delivered by the milkman, and I like the rich, creamy stuff. So it was gold top, and it has a little gold thing on the top, which you press to, like foil that you peel off. And back in the 1930s, the very famous tits, blue tits, long-tailed tits, great tits, learned to sit on the top of the milk bottle, peck their way through and get the cream. This is unhomogenized milk, you understand. The cream comes to the top and they like it. And so do I. And so they peck the bottles. So we always used to get pecked milk bottles on your doorstep every morning. Well, this spread socially. It was studied by biologists at the time. It spread from 2 or 3 different places in England, and you could see it spreading outwards. So clearly it was culturally transmitted. But was it imitation? No, almost certainly not. The birds, imitation was defined back in 1890 something by Thorndike as learning to do something from seeing it done. You could put hearing and so on else. Well, the birds weren't doing anything that birds don't normally do. They sit on things and peck, you know. What they had learned is actually called stimulus enhancement. The stimulus of the shiny top had become salient to these birds. They had perhaps seen one jagged and gone to investigate and found someone else has pecked it. Oh, there's cream. Then next time they'll go and peck one themselves. Pecking is perfectly normal for birds. Similar things apply to chimpanzees learning how to smash things with rocks. It takes them a very long time. And there are arguments about this. I'm not an expert on it, but these kinds of things very often don't involve true imitation. They involve sitting around a long time, picking up the tools someone else has used, and so on. These can lead to different cultures in different species. I would say that some birds are meme machines. They imitate completely new things. Blackbirds around here imitate car alarms and mobile phone tones and, you know, all sorts of things they couldn't possibly have been genetically primed to do. But they can only do it with song. They can't do anything else. African grey parrots and possibly a few other bird species can use their arms. Like, we can imagine flying, can't we? That some of these birds will copy with their wings things we do with our arms, which is fascinating in terms of the body plan that must be inherent in our brains and theirs. So I could go on. Since I wrote The Meme Machine 20 years ago, it's anniversary this year, much has changed in finding imitation in other species. We're a lot more clear about it, but the basic pattern, I would say, is the same. We are the only species who start imitating young. We love imitating. We love being imitated. This goes round and round, and that's why we have this rich culture and they don't.
Mm-hmm. So apart from true imitation, let's say, what are the other cognitive mechanisms that you think we would have to have evolved in order to be able to have memes and to transmit them? Because, I mean, in my conversations with doctors Boyd and Richerson, they referred to certain very interesting things, like, for example, the biases that really allow for us to have culture, like, for example, the content related biases, the context related biases and things like that. That is, there are certain types of information that are easier for us to transmit and to memorize in comparison to others. And when we try to acquire information, perhaps we try to acquire it from the most successful people, or from older people, or from people that are also from our gender and things like that. So we have very different sorts of biases that really explain, at least in some way, how we transmit culture and what is successful culturally and what is not. So do those sorts of biases, do you also consider them in memetics or not?
Yes, absolutely. I think they've done a great job of explaining these biases. I mean, I don't personally use all the same terms as them, but it's quite clear. Obviously, we must have biases as to which memes we pick up and which we don't. We're not looking for good and bad memes in a vacuum, as though that's clear what they are. Things like, copy the best imitator. I gave these things different names from them back to 20 years ago. Their work has evolved enormously, but the basic principle, I would say, the same. Obviously, it helps if you copy memes from someone who's got useful memes for you. And that is so perverted now in the, what are they called? Influencers, who, because they wear these particular trainers or they have these particular headphones or whatever it might be, all the kids at school copy them, and you get this awful, imbalance. So yes, their work is very important in looking at those biases. But I think that the essence of your question, at least where you started out, was about what cognitive abilities we now have that, in my mind, can be explained by the evolution of memes. And this can take us right back to the beginning, when people were beginning to make noises and imitate them from each other in the very beginnings of getting language. Think about a very, very basic principle here, which is that the idea of memetics is to think of memes in informational terms. There's some kind of information that is copied from a person to a statue and back, or a book, or just from person to person, or whatever. Now, if those things are to be transmitted well, then they're best to be digitized. Digital information is self-correcting by its very nature, whereas analog information, you can sort of stray off and so on. There are many other principles I could go on about, but let's start with that one. So why did language evolve the way that it did? Because the sounds, if I try to go, let's see if you can copy this. Can you do that?
I don't think so.
But if I go, ni, mama.
Oh, that's much easier. Yeah. Ni, mama. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So there you have a very simple thing. And you could imagine people beginning to use language to point at things or share, whatever it might be, do things together. Digitizing them into words would be better. So that would necessarily, then those memes would spread faster to more people and more would be used, and they get more digitized, and you'd end up with words. And the same thing when you get to writing very much later, hundreds of thousands of years later, possibly a million or more, then digitization into writing becomes important. So there's a very general sort of physical or logical reason for language to evolve the way it did. But then you have to use some of Boyd and Richerson's biases to think, well, whom are people copying? And if it's, I think, not surprising to imagine that the same people you copy would be the ones you'd mate with. I mean, let's suppose there's somebody in your group sitting around your fire in your cave or whatever it might be, who really is good at keeping fires in and is really good at making stone tools or whatever it might be. Not only will that person be imitated more, but they'll get the best mates. And so to any extent to which their ability was genetically determined, those genes will spread in the gene pool. And so that's why I say that gene meme coevolution would have made us able to speak. Now, that's a different view, slightly different view from the traditional cultural evolution theory, which again is saying that this is all ultimately what Wilson called. He said ultimately the genes will always keep culture on a leash, and
Right.
that is the fundamental view of most biologists interested in the evolution of culture. And I say, no, we're long off the leash. The leash still has, we still have genetic, we're still these bodies, we're still these mouths, well, our brains have changed a lot. Nevertheless, we're not on the leash in the sense that that implies. So what's happening in the memetic view is language started out as a parasite. I mean, it didn't. Everybody else in the world, except for a few memes people, would say, why do we have language? Because it's useful, because it helped our ancestors to hunt better or whatever it was. Whereas I would say, no, that's not true. Once we started imitating, which sort of came about because of whatever conditions there were then, once we started imitating, we started imitating sounds all over the place. Yes, to some extent, the ones that got copied would be the useful ones, but that's not the key point. The key point is whatever can get copied for whatever reason will. And so the memes, the way they evolved, digitizing and so on, drove our brains to produce the ability to do that. Leap on to writing and reading. And still today you can see the consequences of this. It's hard for people to learn to read. It seems harder for boys than girls. They manage it later. Their brains are slightly different in some way. It's a struggle, and the brain becomes, certain parts of the brain become reorganized to be able to read. Why? Because all these words are successful memes. We really were, and typing. I mean, I don't know. I bet there are some studies that I don't know about. But now that everybody can, type on their screen on their phone, I bet there's bits of the brain that come better at that, And so our brains are sculpted by the selfish memes into being able to pass on more memes. That takes us right the way through. They're just examples from the beginning to where we are now of how the memes have driven our brains to become better meme machines.
Mm-hmm. So since we're talking about cognitive mechanisms and perhaps the things that explain why some pieces of information are more successful than others in different cultures, let's say, are you also interested in including in the picture things like inter-individual variation in terms of perhaps certain people with certain personality traits tend to prefer more certain memes, like, for example, let's just pick up on the example of politics, that perhaps are people that follow along left-wing or right-wing politics because they are predisposed to prefer certain types of memes, and that would explain why then people divide themselves into different political tribes, or are you not really interested in those sorts of things?
No, I'm not. There's so much interesting stuff in the world. Science is just, I can't be interested in everything. I have read some studies about the genetic foundations of political opinions, but it's nothing I know very much about. It clearly is relevant to memes, but I'm really interested in the fundamental theory rather than that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on perhaps to another topic here, because in your book you also refer to certain behaviors that are pretty hard to explain from a purely evolutionary perspective, at least if we are only referring to the genetic side of things, like, for example, adoption, homosexuality, ultra cooperation and things like that. And I guess that even now, 20 years later, people are still struggling with these sorts of things. And for example, for homosexuality, there are a lot of different hypotheses, but I don't think that any one of them has been already validated. So could you please explain perhaps how memetics could give us a new basis to tackle these sorts of issues from an evolutionary perspective?
No, I mean, you're asking me to do far more than I can do. That would be brilliant, wouldn't it? But I can say something about it. I think it's quite remarkable how far we've gone, how fast. I wouldn't have predicted. I had gay friends at university back in the early 70s. It was sort of accepted in universities, but generally you didn't mention it, and except amongst close friends and so on. 20 years after that, it was still not so very different. And how amazingly quickly gay marriage has spread in some parts of the world. What interests me here with respect to your question is gay marriage, gay relationships, homosexuality in general is not good from the genes point of view. There are some circumstances in which it might be uncles looking after children, other relationships where genes are shared, but basically it's not. And if you think about the right-left, the classic right-left political spectrum, the right very largely being embedded in religions, and religions, I'm talking here Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the major monotheistic faiths, are basically genes rule okay. Go forth and multiply, have lots of children, bring up your children to be good, whatever it is, Catholics or whatever it is. Promote the religion to as many other people as you can, but fundamentally benefits the genes. Don't go and adopt somebody else, somebody else's child and look after it. Certainly don't indulge in homosexual activities. Don't have abortions. Don't have birth control. Whereas on the other side, as a woman, of course, this is particularly important. Once you escape from the religious and genetic control, then we're talking about what benefits humans and human societies. So it benefits humans and the societies, I would say, to have people who are homosexual by nature to be able to have as happy relationships as everybody else. And it goes right against the genes. So this is one of the very clear examples, I think, where you can see memes as a second replicator bubbling along on the top, using these meme machines and getting off the leash. The leash is the rope that holds back progress, I would call it. Difficult concept, but I think we have progressed in these respects. And it is the genes, aided and abetted by religious memes, predominantly, that we are escaping from. Great. That's one of the optimistic things. I'm very, very, very pessimistic about the memes that have got us into climate change and all sorts of other terrible things. But that's the good. That's the cheery bit of memes winning out over genes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps just one last question. Do you think that new technologies, like, for example, the internet, in any way fundamentally change the way memes are created and transmitted? And of course, since we're referring to the internet here, I'm not talking about what people call memes on the internet, like those funny images that people send to each other and that they call memes, but basically what we are referring to as memes here. Do you think that new technologies and ways of communicating really have a big impact on how memetics work?
Yes, huge impact. Let me just say something about internet memes first, because as you imply, there are a lot of people who didn't realize that internet memes are one tiny weeny bit of the whole world of memes. But interestingly, both Richard Dawkins and I were kind of really annoyed when we realized that people thought a meme was a cat with some words. But actually, I was less cross than him in a way, because internet memes are such a very, very good example to understand the evolutionary process. Because let's take, Canna's cheeseburger or something. The idea of having an animal picture with some words with bad spelling and everything is a perfect example of some information which is copied by lots of different people with variations. And immediately, because of the technology we have, which we absolutely didn't have before, it's easy for people to take an image and some words and now videos and just tweak it a bit. And so let's suppose there are 1 million people who've seen Ken Has Cheeseburger and want to make their own version, and they do, or a lot of them fail because they don't know how to use the technology. A lot succeed. I made lots of images with what I thought were brilliant words. You know, they're up there. I don't think anyone's ever looked at them except me to check if anyone's looked at them. You know, they fail. And so out of these million, nearly all of them would fail. And then, you know, there'd be some dozens or hundreds or so that would become very popular and spread. That is an evolutionary process writ large, simple to see, and because of the new copying machinery. Now, to come back to your the key question you were asking here, which really interests me and worries me at the moment. So, for a long time now, I've been wondering, are all these digital bits of information that we're passing around, doing this podcast, everything we type and send, you know, are these still memes, or is something fundamentally different going on? Now, Richard says it's all just memes. You don't need to think beyond that. This is just more and more and more memes. But I had the idea, and I first expressed this in my TED lecture, which is now more than 10 years old. And I've worked on the ideas a lot more since, that possibly there could be a third replicator. So you have genes are the first replicator on this planet. Memes copied by imitation are the second replicator. What would a third replicator be? So what would a third replicator be? And would we be able to tell if there were one arising in all this technology? Well, that question makes the answer pretty obvious. A replicator has to be information that is copied with variation and selection. Genes do that with all the chemistry. Memes do that with our imitation. Is this machinery that we've invented, all these servers and phones and computers and everything, are they doing it? Are they doing those three themselves? Is the machinery out there that runs the cloud and cyberspace, is that doing copying, varying and selecting without us? And the answer is yes. 10 years ago when I did the TED lecture, I wasn't sure. I mean, I was thinking, well, Google gives a different list to each person, and that's selecting and varying the lists. But I wasn't sure. But now you just see it everywhere. You know, the software that writes news stories, there's plenty that write student essays and you buy them. But the search engines are doing it all the time, and Amazon and Google collecting information from us, all run by algorithms, making decisions on that basis. I therefore conclude that if you take universal Darwinism and the idea of replicators seriously, then we need to consider the possibility that a third replicator is emerging in this technology that we thought we invented for ourselves. Actually, now we've done that in order to have our social media and our fun and everything else. It's a bit like the over-imitation thing. We've given it so much capacity that it's taking off. And that's where I think AI is coming from and will increasingly come from. Not packages put in robots that go around and might turn on us, nothing like that at all. Just the fact that will be a third level of evolution going on that we really don't have insight into because it's doing too much too fast. Should we be completely terrified? Well, we're still here after all the things we've been terrified in the past, but that doesn't mean this one won't be the end of us. But I don't want to be too terrified about it. What I would say is what we should do, given what I've said, is enough people, not just me, take Memetics seriously, ask those questions. Maybe they're rubbish, maybe that's not true, maybe there's no third replicator, but we won't know unless we find out. And if there is, of course, the better we understand it, the better we'll be able to find a good role for human beings in this new world, rather than just slaves to the third replicator.
That's very interesting. So would you say that we can also use the internet and perhaps digital communication in general as another source of evidence and as a source where we can collect information about people's interactions to perhaps better understand how memetics work?
Yes, that's already going on to some extent. There are quite a lot of people some in a memetic framework and some not explicitly so, studying which memes spread, who spreads them, what groups they spread in, the lineages they form, the different lineages, both in internet memes and in other ways that information spreads in technology. So that's going on, and that will definitely help us to assess whether the memetic view is better than other views or not. In the end, it comes down to Darwin's amazing insight, which is so obvious when you get it, but most people on the planet don't get it, which is just take something, copy, vary, and select it, and that's where all design in the universe comes from. That's what I would say. All design in the universe comes from that. When we design something, we call ourselves the designer, but it's just the competitive memes in our head that we've taken in, we're mixing them up, and we're producing something new. That's creativity, that's design. In a sense, we're the designer, but the real designer is the evolutionary competition between memes. And that's how we should look at the world. That, it seems to me, is the greatest contribution that memetics can make, is to understand the nature of design and of creativity. And it's not magic, it's not soul, spirits, and consciousness. It is the evolutionary algorithm. Thank you, Darwin.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Blackmore, just before we go, would you like to tell people what might be some of the best places on the internet for them to go and learn a little bit more about your work?
Goodness me, I would love to say that my memes page on my website would give them brilliant opportunities, but it's not that brilliant. But if they go on my website, which is just susanblackmore.uk, there is a memetics page which has a list of my own publications, or there's a thing called topics, and on there is memes, and there are plenty of articles there that people can choose. But the TED lecture is a very good starting point because, you know, being a TED lecture, it's only 18 minutes or something, and I hope I've done a succinct job, and perhaps that would be a good starting place and take it from there. Or read The Selfish Gene. Read The Selfish Gene. I mean, that's still worth doing.
Yeah, it's amazing because it's a 40-year-old book, but it's still relevant today, right?
Absolutely, it is. Yes. Start there.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the video so that people can go there and check it all out. So, Dr. Blackmore, thank you again for being on the show. It was really a pleasure talking to you, and maybe in the future I could have you again on the show. I don't know.
Another time we can talk about near-death experiences and out of the body and consciousness and how it doesn't have any powers. And I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we may do so again. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel on February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You also have the alternative of supporting me on Subscribestar or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerreiro, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jan Haninen, and my two producers. These are Webb and Rosie. Thank you for all.